Nicole pulled her coat tighter around herself as she stood in front of the towering structure. The abandoned newspaper building loomed over her, its faded sign barely legible under years of dust and neglect. The late afternoon sky cast a dim glow over the crumbling brick, and the wind carried a whisper through the shattered windows. She had been here for nearly 15 minutes now, shifting on her feet, peering through the darkness inside, waiting. Where was Andrew? It had been 2 weeks since their first adventure. 2 weeks since they had stumbled into the abandoned theater, and in the process, stumbled into each other's lives. They had talked often since that night, sometimes for hours, their conversations stretching past midnight, and yet they had not seen each other since. Nicole had wondered if their meeting had been a fleeting moment, a chance encounter that would fade like a dream. But when Andrew suggested they meet here, at the old newspaper building, she had felt a spark of excitement. Now, standing alone in the cold, she wasn't so sure. She looked up at the building again, its tall, arched windows reflecting the muted light of the setting sun. The Daily Gazette had once been the beating heart of the city, a place where ink-stained journalists had rushed to meet deadlines, where stories had been shaped, where voices had been heard. Now, it was a forgotten relic. Its presses silent, its halls empty. Nicole exhaled, watching her breath swirl in the air. A part of her debated leaving. Maybe Andrew had changed his mind. Maybe something had come up. Maybe he just wasn't coming. Then, a sound. A soft creak, the groan of metal shifting. Nicole turned sharply, her pulse quickening. But the street was empty. The wind tugged at a loose street sign, making it sway and squeak. She released a slow breath, shaking off the unease. "All right, Andrew," she muttered under her breath. "If you don't show up in the next 5 minutes, I'm going in without you." She wasn't sure if she was saying it for herself, or for the possibility that he was already inside, waiting to surprise her. Nicole took another glance at her phone. No messages. No missed calls. Fine. Steeling herself, she took a step toward the entrance. The doors were still intact, but aged and weather-worn. One of them hung slightly ajar, enough for a person to slip through. She placed a gloved hand against the cool surface and pushed gently. The door gave with a soft groan, revealing a dim interior cloaked in dust and shadows. Nicole hesitated. The silence inside felt heavier than the cold air outside, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. She swallowed and stepped through the threshold, the scent of old paper and damp wood filling her senses. Her boots echoed faintly against the dusty tile floor as she ventured inside. Rows of old desks stretched before her, covered in scattered papers and abandoned typewriters, their keys frozen in time. The place had been left in a hurry, as if one day the workers simply walked away and never returned. A broken clock on the far wall still read 3:17, though whether AM or PM, she had no way of knowing. She turned slowly, scanning the room. "Andrew?" No response. Her finger brushed against the edge of a nearby desk, disturbing a layer of dust that swirled in the faint light. The eerie silence pressed against her ears. She wasn't usually one to scare easily, but there was something unsettling about abandoned places. They held too many echoes, too many forgotten voices, too many forgotten stories. Nicole tried to shake off the unease. She had explored many abandoned places alone, but there was something comforting in exploring the abandoned theater with Andrew, and the fact that he wasn't here made her feel a bit uneasy exploring alone. Nicole let out a small sigh and shook her head. Well, I guess I'm exploring alone. She pulled out a small flashlight from her coat pocket and flicked it on. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing more scattered papers, old press badges, and faded photographs. Some of them still had headlines printed across the top. Mysterious disappearances continue. No leads. Local journalist missing after night shift. City's biggest scandal. Cover-up or coincidence? Nicole frowned. The headlines felt out of place, eerie in their specificity. She ran a finger over one of the papers, her eyes skimming the text beneath the bold lettering. It detailed the disappearance of a journalist named Henry Cole, who had been investigating something controversial before vanishing without a trace. The article was unfinished, cut off mid-sentence, as if whoever had been writing it had been interrupted. A soft thud echoed from deeper in the building. Nicole's breath caught. She whipped around, aiming her flashlight toward the sound. It had come from the far end of the room, where a set of double doors stood slightly ajar. A stairwell, maybe? Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. It could have been the wind, or an animal, or... Nicole? The voice was soft, uncertain, but unmistakable. She turned toward the entrance, just in time to see Andrew stepping inside, his silhouette framed against the dying light. He was slightly out of breath, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his dark eyes scanning the room before landing on her. "There you are," she said, her voice more relieved than she intended. Andrew gave her a smile as he walked toward her. "Sorry, I got held up. Traffic." Nicole raised an eyebrow. "Traffic? Andrew, you walk everywhere." He scratched the back of his head. "All right, fine. I may have lost track of time." She smirked, shaking her head. Typical. Andrew glanced around, his expression shifting as he took in the abandoned newsroom. "This place is something." "That's one way to put it," she responded. He nodded toward the old newspaper in her hand. "Find anything interesting?" Nicole hesitated, then held it up. "Actually, yeah. Apparently, a journalist went missing while working here. And there's more. Other disappearances. Strange stories." Andrew took the paper from her, scanning the faded words. His brow furrowed. "This is weird." Nicole crossed her arms. "You don't say." Another sound echoed from the far end of the room, a soft creak, like a door being pushed open. Andrew and Nicole glanced at each other. "Well," he said, handing the newspaper back, "I guess we're about to find out just how weird this place really is." Nicole exhaled, rolling her shoulders. "Guess so." And with that, they stepped deeper into the shadows together. The second floor of the abandoned newspaper building felt heavier than the first. Dust swirled in the air with each step Nicole and Andrew took, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. The large windows were streaked with grime, casting hazy patches of light that barely reached the floor. "This place is bigger than I thought," Andrew murmured, shining his flashlight over rows of cubicles with long-dead computers and overturned chairs. Nicole trailed her hand along the edge of a desk, her fingers collecting dust. "Yeah, makes you wonder how a place like this just gets left behind." Andrew glanced at her, catching the thoughtful crease in her brow. "Things fall apart. People move on. Nicole hummed, neither agreeing or disagreeing. She kicked aside a fallen stack of newspapers, her flashlight passing over a faded headline from years ago. "Did you always want to be a writer?" she asked, her tone casual but curious. Andrew hesitated for a second before replying, "Yeah, ever since I was a kid, I used to make my own little newspapers, writing stories about neighborhood happenings. It was mostly about old Mrs. Keating's cat getting stuck in a tree." He chuckled lightly. "Guess I never grew out of it." Nicole smirked. "Bet Mrs. Keating appreciated the coverage." He shrugged. "Not really. She said I exaggerated the drama." Nicole laughed softly, the sound warm against the cold emptiness of the building. I could picture it. Daring rescue under moonlight sky, or something like that. Close. I think I went with local hero saves terrified feline in midnight mission. Nicole rolled her eyes but grinned. "Yeah, I see why she called it an exaggeration." They moved deeper into the floor, pausing at a row of tall file cabinets. Andrew idly testing one of the drawers, finding it locked. He didn't bother trying another one. Nicole observed him for a moment before asking, "So, why abandon places?" He lifted a brow. "Why not?" She crossed her arms. "I mean, of all the hobbies, why explore forgotten buildings?" Andrew leaned against the cabinet, considering her question. "There's something about places like this. It's like walking through a moment frozen in time, a story left unfinished." Nicole's gaze lingered on his face, catching the brief flicker of something unspoken in his expression. "You ever lose someone?" Andrew's jaw tensed, but he didn't immediately answer. Instead, he turned his flashlight toward the far end of the office, where a hallway stretched into darkness. "Come on," he said, changing the subject. "Let's see what's down here." Nicole let it go for now. She had her suspicions, but she wouldn't push. She knew what it was like to keep certain parts of yourself locked away. They passed a break room, a conference area, and what looked like a storage closet, each space littered with old papers and relics of an old era long past. Eventually, they reached a heavy wooden door marked Editor-in-Chief. Unlike the others, it was slightly ajar. Andrew reached for the handle, but Nicole stopped him. "Wait." He looked at her, puzzled. Nicole nodded toward the floor. "There are marks on the dust, like someone's been in there recently." Andrew's pulse quickened. He carefully pushed the door open, revealing an office that seemed eerily untouched, except for one disturbing detail. The desk, an imposing mahogany piece, was covered in papers scattered in disarray. A toppled lamp lay on its side. The chair behind the desk was askew, as if someone had stood up suddenly or been forced up. But the real shock came from the dark stain on the wooden floor near the chair. Nicole inhaled sharply. "That's blood." Andrew crouched down, running his fingers over the floorboards. The stain was old, dried, but unmistakable. His mind raced. What had happened here? Nicole reached for the papers on the desk, scanning them for clues. "Look at this." She held up a sheet with a half-written article, the ink smudged and uneven, as if it had been hurriedly written. The title read, "Corruption Scandal at City Hall, the Truth They Don't Want You to Know." Andrew exhaled. "That's not the kind of story you just abandon." Nicole flipped through more pages. Some were memos, others notes filled with scribbled names and dates. Then she found a torn envelope with a letter inside. The words were brief, but chilling. "You're getting too close. Drop it before it's too late." Nicole looked up at Andrew, her expression grim. Someone didn't want this story getting out. Andrew's mind pieced together possibilities. A journalist chasing a dangerous lead, a confrontation in this office, someone silenced before they could publish the truth. Nicole turned to the bookshelf, scanning the dusty titles before pulling out a thin, leather-bound notebook wedged between legal texts. The cover bore no title, but when she flipped it open, the first page read, Ethan Caldwell. Andrew's breath caught. That name sounds familiar. Nicole skimmed through the pages, her fingers tightening around the book. It should. Ethan Caldwell was the investigative reporter who went missing over a decade ago. Andrew's stomach turned. You think this was his office? Nicole nodded, flipping through the pages. Looks like he was working on something big before he disappeared. A creak from outside the office made them both freeze. Andrew's grip tightened on his flashlight. Nicole slowly closed the notebook and tucked it into her bag. They exchanged a glance, unspoken understanding passing between them. They weren't alone, but someone might not want them finding out the truth. The silence in the editor's office stretched, thick and oppressive. Andrew and Nicole stood motionless, listening. The sound had been faint, just a whisper of movement outside the room, but it was enough to set their nerves on edge. Andrew gestured for Nicole to stay back as he stepped toward the door, his flashlight beam barely flickering. He peered into the hallway, his pulse hammering in his ears. Nothing but darkness met his gaze, but the uneasy sensation of being watched refused to fade. Nicole clutched the notebook tighter against her chest. Something's not right, she murmured, barely above a whisper. We're not alone, are we? Andrew's jaw tightened. I don't think so. He wasn't the paranoid type, but something about this place. The blood-stained floor, the unfinished article, the chilling warning were starting to feel less like a mystery and more like a warning they should heed. Nicole glanced toward the papers she had been examining, the ones Ethan Caldwell had left behind. She hesitated. Should we take more? This could be important. Andrew exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Not right now. We need to get out of here first. Nicole nodded, sensing the urgency in his voice. As much as she wanted to keep searching, the weight of the unknown presence outside the office was too much to ignore. Moving carefully, Andrew took the lead, stepping back into the hallway. The shadows felt heavier now, stretching and shifting in the dim glow of their flashlights. He could hear Nicole's soft footsteps behind him, matching his pace. Every now and then, he cast a glance her way, making sure she was close. Nicole noticed. She noticed the way his body angled slightly in front of her, the way his shoulders tensed every time they passed an open doorway. He was watching out for her, protecting her. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Do you think, Nicole hesitated, do you think someone followed us here? Andrew exhaled through his nose. It's possible. Or maybe someone never left. Nicole shivered at that thought. That's not reassuring. They reached the stairwell, pausing at the top. The steps leading down seemed darker than before, the air thick with dust and uncertainty. Andrew took a step forward, then froze. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A soft creak from somewhere below. Nicole's hand gripped his arm instinctively. That was, I know, he whispered. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Andrew flicked off his flashlight, plunging them into near darkness. Nicole followed his lead, her breath shallow as they stood frozen, waiting. Another creak, closer this time. Nicole's grip on his arm tightened. She could feel Andrew's muscles tense beneath her fingers, his breathing slow and controlled. He was listening, calculating. Then ever so slowly he leaned toward her and whispered, "We go slow, quiet, no sudden movements." Nicole swallowed hard, but nodded. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was sure it would give them away. Step by step they descended. The dim light from the grimy windows on the first floor barely illuminated their surroundings. The large open space was just as they had left it. Desks overturned, papers scattered, remnants of a forgotten era. But something about it felt different now. The presence, the weight in the air was heavier. Andrew motioned for Nicole to stay close as they navigated the floor. They moved swiftly toward the exit, avoiding the main path and sticking to the shadows. Every so often, he'd glance over his shoulder, but the oppressive silence remained unbroken. Nicole let out a shaky breath as they neared the front door. Relief was just within reach. A metallic clang rang through the building, sharp and jarring. Nicole flinched, and Andrew instinctively stepped in front of her, shielding her from whatever or whoever had made that noise. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from somewhere deeper in the building, a door creaked open. Nicole's throat went dry. Her fingers brushed against Andrew's back, grounding herself. "We need to move," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Andrew did not need convincing. He grabbed her hand, his grip firm, and pulled her toward the door. They didn't run, not yet, but their pace quickened. Every nerve in their bodies screamed at them to get out before someone stepped into view. The door groaned as Andrew pushed it open, the night air rushing to greet them. They didn't stop moving until they were outside, away from the building's looming frame. Only then did they turn back, breathless. The window stared at them like vacant eyes, revealing nothing. But the feeling lingered, the unmistakable sensation of being watched from within the darkened halls. Neither of them spoke for a moment, only the sound of their heavy breathing filling the space between them. Nicole finally broke the silence. "That was," she exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't know what that was." Andrew ran a hand through his hair, still scanning the building, as if expecting something or someone to emerge. "I don't like it," he admitted. "Someone doesn't want people snooping around in there." Nicole glanced down at the notebook she had tucked into her bag. "Which means we might be onto something." Andrew turned to her then, his expression serious. "Nicole, this might not be safe." She smirked, despite the situation. "Getting cold feet?" Andrew huffed. "No, but I don't like the idea of you getting caught up in something dangerous." Nicole raised an eyebrow. "And what about you?" "I can handle myself." Nicole folded her arms. "And I can't?" "That's not what Andrew stopped, sighing. "Look, He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just don't want you getting hurt." Nicole's smirk faded slightly. She hadn't expected him to say it so plainly. There was something about the way he looked at her just then, like he genuinely meant it. For once, she didn't know what to say. The air between them shifted into an awkward silence. Finally, Nicole cleared her throat. "So, same time next week?" Andrew blinked. "What?" She shrugged, trying to lighten the mood. "Next abandoned building. You're not backing out, are you?" Andrew studied her for a moment before shaking his head with a small, amused exhale. "No, I'll be there." Nicole gave him a nod before turning away, heading toward her car. Andrew watched her go, that lingering feeling of protectiveness still settling uncomfortably in his chest. He didn't know what they had just stumbled into. He didn't know if it was worth the risk. But he knew one thing for certain. He'd see her again soon.